Доброго дня. Мене звати Вишлінський Гліб, я є
Good
виконавчим директором
evening.
Центру
My name is Gleb
економічної
Vishlinsky. I'm the
стратегії
executive director for
і
the Center of
вітаю
Economic
вас
Strategy, and I
сьогодні
would like to welcome you
на
at
нашому
our monthly
щомісячному
event,
заході,
which we are
який ми
conducting together
проводимо
with
з
since
2022
2022.
року.
And
І
this is the
це є серія
series of
заходів
events
про
about the
економіку
economy of
України під
Ukraine
час
during the
війни.
war. Every
Кожного
month
місяця
we
ми
are
обираємо
selecting
нову тему, і сьогоднішня наша тема, спеціальна тема, про яку ми говоритимемо з зовнішніми експертами і про яку ми робитимемо спеціальну презентацію. А додатково до нашого щомісячного огляду, це тема, наскільки українська економіка близька до Європейського Союзу, огляд прогресу за рік. Власне, ця тема пов'язана з презентованим кілька тижнів тому звітом про розширення Європейського Союзу. Цю серію заходів ми проводимо спільно з German Economic Team, і ще з технічних моментів English translation is available in the panel below. Відповідно, обидві версії будуть доступні потім на наших каналах в
in
нашому
our
каналі в
YouTube
YouTube.
channel.
І
And any
будь-які
questions
питання
to the
до спікерів
speakers,
ви можете
please keep
залишати в
in the
розділі
Q&A.
Q&A.
And
А
now I would like
зараз
to
я
ask
прошу до
and to
слова
be
нашого
pass the
партнера
floor
з
from German
German
Economic
Economic
Team,
Team, проектного менеджера
Project
Гаррі
Manager, Mr.
Полушкіна.
Gary
Гаррі,
Polushkin. Gary,
прошу
please,
тебе
the floor
слово.
is yours.
Thank you very much. Warm welcome from Germany to all participants of this today's webinar that we are conducting together with the Center for Economic Strategy since the full-scale war has begun. It's a great pleasure for me as the project manager for Ukraine of the German Economic Team to introduce this webinar as part of our continuous strong cooperation between the Center for Economic Strategy and the German Economic Team. The German Economic Team is an economic policy advisory project financed by the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action and has been conducting advising activities in Ukraine and advising the Ukrainian government and state institutions for more than 15 years. I'm very glad to see so many listeners here in today's webinar because this webinar has and will further connect stakeholders from Ukraine as well as from abroad to improve and discuss Ukraine's economic, financial, and social situation facing Russia's full-scale war. And this webinar is also an important opportunity to discuss the monitoring of Ukraine's economy, as well as today's topic, the EU integration and Ukraine's reform path towards it. Facing a full-scale war with its military, financial, economic, and social consequences, Ukraine is simultaneously going through a comprehensive reform path. This reform effort has led the EU and Ukraine to start membership negotiations. And the EU is supporting Ukraine in this path through its Ukraine Facility Pillar 3. And this reform effort has also been recognized by the EU in the recent Enlargement Country Report. Moreover, the reform effort supports the economic recovery of Ukraine. Countries like Poland, Hungary recorded GDP per capita in US dollar statistics 6 years before membership that is similar to Ukraine's current. And due to their reforms, the growth rates accelerated strongly in the next years. And so will Ukraine's growth path if the reform path is kept. These aspects will be discussed today, and I very look forward to the discussion and welcome all participants. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gary. And now we will move to the first part of our monthly event. And this is the review of the Ukrainian economy in October. This part will be moderated by me, and then I will pass the moderation to my colleague, who will be reporting and explaining the topic of the Enlargement Report and the situation with the economic part of the European integration. But once again, I will present my colleague a little bit later. So now I would like to pass the floor to Maxim Simalyuk, to our economist, who will present the overall economic situation, its dynamics in October, and also will tell us about the situation in the budget. Thank you, Gleb. Welcome to all the participants of today's event. Traditionally, we start our monthly review of economy with the macroeconomic trends, what has changed since the last months. In the last forecast, the National Bank of Ukraine, this forecast was published just very recently in the very fresh inflation report from NBU. The National Bank has updated the growth of GDP, having raised it from 3.7 up to 4% of GDP growth. And the main factor for the improvement was much less electricity shortages and the slightly less than expected deficit of energy and slightly higher harvests of early grain crops. At the same time, the Institute of Economic Research estimates that real GDP increased 2.1% year-to-year in Q3 of 2024. This is significantly lower than forecasted by the NBU, which expected a 4% GDP growth in Q3. At the same time, the final information regarding the growth of GDP we will get later, once it's published by the State Statistics Service. In October, also, we had better expectations from the business. At the same time, it's important to mention that almost in all sectors reviewed, apart from the sector of services, the expectations deteriorated, but at the same time, comparing to previous months, the expectations of business, according to the research done by the National Bank, improved, but they still remain lower than the neutral level. So business have many more negative expectations than positive. The key factors that limit these expectations remain the risks of further attacks on the energy infrastructure. This is the issue that is very much of concern to business, very fairly. Also, over the last months, we have had more shelling of the port infrastructure, and we understand that the Ukrainian Sea Corridor has really helped other industries to bounce back. Also, we have still the problem of labor shortages and rising business costs. A few words about the fiscal sector, what was happening with the Ukrainian budget over the last months. In October, the trend continued in terms of the growth of the tax revenues. Within 1 month, the state budget received more than 121 billion hryvnia. That's 32% more than 32% more than the same months last year. The growth continues to be driven by consumption taxes. As it's known, very recently we stopped the process of finalizing the taxation changes, but this package of changes is not yet signed by the president. That creates another uncertainty for the business and for the budget process, which is evidently affecting negatively. And this draft law has to be signed ASAP because all deadlines are gone. In case we look at the state budget expenses from September, this is the last months available from the state statistics. The defense spending stayed more or less at the same level as previous months. With this, we see that the foreign military support increased that was going through the state budget of Ukraine. So within 9 months of 2024, state budget expenses, not including in-kind military support, reached almost 3 trillion hryvnia, and that's slightly more than the same period of previous year. Out of this 3 trillion hryvnia, almost 1.5 trillion, these are defense and security expenses. In September, there were quite low expenses on debt service, which is just slightly less than previous months. This week, Ukraine has received another tranche of grant financing from the United States. And with this, the international financing of Ukraine has achieved $100 billion since the start of the full-scale war. This Ukraine foreign financial assistance has kept Ukraine from collapsing and has had this relatively positive situation in the economy, which we have now in the conditions of the full-scale war. In general, Ukraine and the Ukrainian budget was supported by 27 different countries and organizations, and the biggest are the European Union, with the contribution of more than $40.5 billion, USA with $28 billion, and IMF that gave more than $11 billion of the loan financing, and which is also the basis for the remaining financing of the Ukraine budget, because all our partners are looking at IMF. 1/3 of this funding was disbursed to Ukraine in the form of grants and 67% in form of some concessional loans. Even though the amount of funding provided to Ukraine is unprecedented, it is still less than need. These loans are really concessional. We don't have to pay the principal amount within some decades, but the interest rate will be paid by partially our partners. So even though that such amount of financing that was given to Ukraine is absolutely unprecedented, nevertheless, it still does not cover all our budget needs. During the years of the full-scale war, the state budget deficit, excluding the grants, exceeded $122 billion. Another $33.5 billion was spent on repaying domestic and foreign debts. Correspondingly, the foreign financing has covered some 64% of budget needs. At the same time, this financing is really unprecedented. It really has kept Ukrainian economy from collapse, and we are very much thankful to the Ukrainian partners for financing the Ukrainian budget, continue to finance it, and will continue to do so. Thank you. My part is finalized. Passing the floor to my colleagues. Thank you, Maxim, for this very detailed and important review, especially when it comes to the long-term evaluation since the start of the full-scale war of this international financial assistance. It's very important to understand the scale of this support. Now I would like to pass the floor to Maria Tamilina, who will talk about the situation in the cash, monetary, FX, and banking sectors. I hope you can hear me and you can see the screen. So let us start. As always, among the analysis of our key rates, in October, I think in the end of October, the National Bank decided to keep the key policy key rate at the same time, 13%. The reason why this key rate is not changed, it's actually to provide sustainability of the FX market, keep control over the inflation expectations, and to slow down inflation in the coming months. And in general, it is expected that the key policy rate will likely remain at 13% in the coming months. Nevertheless, there is a chance that NBU could raise it like to 14%. Some members of the management board of NBU have mentioned about that, but that could happen in case we have the further price pressure exceeding the forecast. Also, we have seen that the yields of some deposits and government bonds, they have remained the same time. They continue to protect savings from inflation, and the inflation itself, last month, it continued to accelerate. It has reached 9.7% year to year. That means that it was 1.8% increase. And why we are seeing this speed up of inflation is because, first of all, This is not very good weather conditions that have affected the harvest. It's less than expected, as well as the further growth of business costs for power and labor. In general, the inflation pressure will be preserved for the next months. Once again, why? Because there will be less proposal of food products, also the expansion of the aggregate demand through budget expenditures, the growth of salaries, and the deficit of power during the heating season. We can now move to the international reserves. They continue to decline slowly, and they have reached $36.6 billion as at the end of October. That's 4.6 months of import coverage. It's not a bad indicator, and this dynamics is due to the fact that NBU continues FX interventions, continues to pay according to the foreign debt, and the money used by the National Bank, they were not fully covered at the expense of arrivals from international partners and from placing foreign currency bonds. If we talk about the FX rate, and as you can see, it has been quite stable in October. Nevertheless, what we see that the net demand stayed, and the biggest sales of FX had to increase up to 3.4 billion, and at the expense of this, the difference between the cash and the official rate remained very small. If we talk about what's happening in the banking sector, about the deposits, that we can see some data for September. This is the latest available. The deposits on demand in hryvnia and in USD continue to grow, although we see some stagnation from the long-term hryvnia deposits, although the foreign currency deposits continue to grow. Also, the National Bank has done the survey in terms of banking loans, and they have found out that the deposits of households and businesses alike continue to rise. And in general, there is expected that the rates will slowly go down, especially for households, while the terms will remain more or less the same during the year. If we talk about lending, we can see here that we see that it continues to grow, and in terms of the conditions of the banking loans, that it grows, so there is the growth for demand of loans. So the reason is the capital investments, the turnover capital, restructuring of debts, and the lower rates. And I would like to shortly tell you what was and what is the latest macroeconomic forecast of the National Bank. My colleague has already mentioned that the economic growth improved. We expect, NBU expects that in 2024 GDP growth would be 4% and 4.6% in 2026. If we talk in more detail about inflation, in the macro forecast that was published in the Inflation Report in the beginning of November, in the first days, it is expected to reach 9.7% by the end of 2024. So we are already seeing this, so it's likely that it will be higher than this. But already in the end of next year, it will continue to decline. And the reasons for that should be the improvement of proposal of offer of food products, and harvest will grow. So we believe that it should go back to its targeted value of 5%, and quite shortly about what will be happening with international reserves. It is expected that at the expense of receiving funds from international partners in the upcoming years, the National Bank will be good to maintain enough reserves throughout the next years. They will remain at a quite an acceptable level. At this is all. I'm passing the floor back to Gleb.
Да, Маша,
Thank you,
дякую.
Maria.
І
And the last
остання
part
частина
of
нашої
our general
загальноекономічної
economic presentation,
презентації.
Vladimir
Володимир
Landa, the
Ланда, старший
senior
економіст,
economist,
коротко
shortly about
про
what
те,
was
що
happening
відбувалося в
in
окремих секторах
several
української
sectors of the Ukrainian
економіки
economy
протягом
throughout
року. Прошу, Володимир.
2024
Дякую, Глібе, дякую,
October.
колеги.
Thank you, Gleb.
Кілька
Thank you,
слів перед
colleagues.
нашою спеціальною
A few
темою
words
про традиційний
about
огляд
the
ключових секторів
condition
української
of the
економіки.
key
Починаємо
sectors of the
традиційно
Ukrainian
з
economy. We start
енергетики.
traditionally from
Як ми
energy,
вже казали
and as we
раніше,
said before, the
дефіцит
deficit of electric
електроенергії
energy
залишається,
remains,
проте значно
although much
меншим,
less
ніж всі
than
це
everybody
закладали
expected
в
in the
прогнозах. Ми
forecasts. We
пам'ятаємо, що
remember that
минула
last
осінь була
autumn was
пов'язана
quite
з
connected with out of regular
регулярними
power outages
відключеннями і
with the
графіками,
graphs,
поза графіками.
with the
Зараз ми
schedules
цього не
out of the
спостерігаємо,
schedules.
принаймні, якщо брати Київ,
We don't see
понад
this
2
over
місяці немає
2
відключень
months. We don't have
побутових
this
споживачів.
outages, but for the household
було заявлено, що
consumers,
будуть вводитися
they
в окремих
said that
регіонах
maybe
обмеження
they will introduce
або
limitations
часу постачання
in several
електроенергії
regions to
промисловим
industrial
і
and to business
бізнес-споживачам,
consumers,
або
or
буде
there could be
обмеження на
some
потужність. Міністр
limitation
енергетики
to
попросив не
the
називати це відключенням.
power
І сказав, що
size.
цю новину
The
не
Minister
зовсім
of
коректно
Energy
інтерпретували в медіа,
asked
оскільки
not
про
to
відключення
comment on that.
від
It was not
електроенергії на
interpreted
регулярній основі
correctly
не йдеться, і це
by the
такі
media, said the
тимчасові
minister. We're not talking
разові
about
заходи.
anything regular. It's like one-off events, and the net commercial import
скоротився за місяць у 3,6
in October
рази, хоча, як ви
decreased
розумієте,
3.6 times,
погодні
although
умови стало
the weather
холодніше.
conditions have become much colder.
Чистий імпорт склав
So the
121
net
гігават, причому на відміну
imports
від
was 1
попередніх місяців ми
gigawatt,
маємо
and
казати,
that's
що саме
really net
чистий імпорт, і
imports,
він
and it
складається
consists
з
of
182
182
гігават
gigawatt hours of imports
імпорту та
and 61
61
gigawatt hours of
гігават
exports.
години експорту.
And basically, starting from the 2nd to the 9th of October, you can see on the right graph, there was a period when Ukraine was a net exporter of electric energy, and this was like the first period starting from March this year. Also, the government has launched a large-scale program of support of Ukrainians before winter that includes housing subsidies for almost 3 million families. That's basically every fourth family in Ukraine, with simplified procedures for military personnel, for IDPs, and also up to 500,000 households will receive financing for the soiled fuel purchase, including wood and coal. And there is a separate payment to families who live in the frontline regions, not electric energy, but with other types of fuel, they have to be provided. In terms of agriculture, as we already said previous months, to worry about the short decrease of exports of oil seeds, we don't have to worry. It has already increased even more than expected, and gone over the indicator of last October, and actually it has reached more than 5 million tons within just October. More than 80%, 7 to 81% was provided with the Black Sea corridor, and some 10% are exported by railway. So that's also something that has not been around for a long time, but before the full-scale invasion, the railway was never a priority direction for export. And although we spoke before that the harvest of this season exceeded some forecasts, it will be still lower than previous year, and the current amount is some 75 million tons, so we don't expect any record numbers. We don't have these expectations at this time, but the indicators should more or less coincide with the levels of previous year. Also, all of the aspects of each sector we can touch. Nevertheless, every month we're touching on something special. This time we want to mention something that has been around for a long time. That's demining, and that's continuously in progress. We'll have the state support of these programs, and just within October, 24,000 hectares were cleared of mines, and the overall amount of agricultural land demined amounted to 289,000 hectares, out of which 80% are actually in Kherson region and 20% on the other regions of Ukraine. In terms of metallurgical production, there is this slow decrease. It continues. The steel production decreased by 1% than previous months, namely 604,000 tons. That's actually the lowest level in the last 8 months. Rolled steel production plummeted by 12% to a yearly low of 442,000 tons. Pig iron production increased symbolically, but that is explained by the more days in October compared to September. In general, thanks to the good first half a year, the indicators continue to be relatively more successful than previous year. The main iron and steel production in 10 months shows 21 to 26 growth year to year, while the domestic consumption isn't growing. The domestic consumption actually decreased by 10% to 2.6 million tons. And one other thing which I wanted to add, that we still have the increase of the exports of iron ore by 31% compared to September, and we would exported 2.5 million tons. And if the average export price was $84 per ton, then in October it fell to $66 per ton. That is a very low level, even comparing with the low world prices. And the iron ore which we're exporting, part of it, unfortunately, is turned into raw products, which is imported. Then we were talking about this in more detail in our previous meeting. You can look it up. When metallurgy was a special meeting, there was a lot of details. And to finalize about the exports of IT services, let me remind you that last month we said that in August we had the minimum exports of such services since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. This time in September, this export grew by 2% to $519 million. But once again, let me repeat that this is in the framework of, let's put it this way, some insignificant fluctuations, and the trend is unfortunately to go down. Over the 9 months, the general exports reached almost $4.8 billion, and that's a 5% down from the same period of previous year. The key areas are the same: the UK, the US, and only in the US it's 38%. That means the $2 billion of such services are exported just to the United States. And from the other trends, if we talked about biggest companies of Ukraine, the number of vacancies has increased by 8% to the maximum of last February, and it's actually 5,684 vacancies. the greatest demand is for marketers and analysts. There is also a need for front-end developers, project managers, and HR specialists. And regarding the HR specialists, there is a huge need of these specialists for the IT sphere since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. This is all, and I'm passing the floor to my colleagues. Yes, Volodymyr, thank you. Now, basically, I would like to pass over the moderation to my colleague Yana Ohrimenko, who is a senior economist of the Center of Economic Strategy, and she is responsible for the direction of the European integration. Yana will make a review of the Enlargement Report in part of the economic part, and she will present our participants of our today's discussion, together with whom Yana will discuss this topic. Yana, please, the floor is yours. Many thanks, Gleb. I really hope that my slides are visible. Yes, everything's fine. So, in the end of October 2024, there was another report on enlargement that had the description of the readiness of Ukraine to enter the European Union with various negotiation chapters, and it also evaluated the progress that was done from November 23, meaning from the last enlargement report. I suggest to start with the general overview where we are at the moment, and that's important to start from the aspect that in no chapter we were able to have the advanced level of preparation. So that max that we have, it's what we say the good level of preparation. It's important to mention that we have several successes, especially when it comes to the customs union and also foreign security and defense policy. That's where we observe both a good level of preparation and a good progress. Also, in general, we see good progress with economic chapters, taxation, economic and monetary policy, as well as the industrial policy. And if we talk about the chapter which is behind, that's basically freedom of movement for workers, or the mobility of workers. And compared to 2023, only one chapter, it's chapter 20, the industrial policy showed a change in preparation level, the way that it is being evaluated by the European Commission. So we improved from some level to between some and moderate level of preparation. It's important to mention that in general, the best looks cluster 3, that's inclusive economic growth. We have some taxation chapters, and if we talk about some fundamental conditions of acceding to yes, to the EU, the situation doesn't look that promising as of now. We would really want to concentrate a little bit on what will mean for Ukraine the full-scale transposition of the European legislation and adopting all European norms and rules, apart basically from the free access to the European markets. This will give us the possibility to make a number of significant reforms. Some of them have already been completed, and some of them have already positively affected the level of development and the financial resilience of Ukraine during the war. In particular, it's important to mention here the NBU reforms in the sphere of financial services. These were the reforms aimed at making the financial sector more healthy, implementation of rules which should promote stability, decrease the risks, contribute to the transparency and the like. And what we are seeing now during full-scale war, the Ukrainian banking system, the Ukrainian financial markets continue to work, and very often this was thanks to the previous efforts from NBU to implement European rules which regulate financial services. And if we talk about the free movement of capital, on the one hand, that is facilitated by establishing rules against money laundering. That's what we are seeing already now. All of these requirements in relation to the transparent structure, it all appeared to a great extent thanks to the implementation of this chapter, and during the full-scale war and some significant limitations, Ukraine is kind of facilitating and removing barriers to capital, and most importantly, that we are opening our markets for the international investors, but it also pertains to the Ukrainian companies. If we talk about the economic and monetary policy, we still have certain challenges with the implementation of the medium-term budgeting, but at the same time, we moved quite well. But the medium-term budget planning, apart from the fact that it's a condition of fulfilling recommendations that pertain to this section, but it's also an instrument that allows to budget long-term investment projects. So that is something that has to expand our planning framework and to contribute to economic growth and high investment and public finances. If we talk about agriculture and the development of rural areas, this is one of the controversial chapters when it comes to Ukraine. It helps to set up the adequate system of agricultural lands and the transparent mechanism to make subsidies and direct. Nevertheless, it's important to mention that the Ukraine's negotiations on ECUs started with fundamental criteria, they will end with fundamental criteria, and these fundamentals, they include democracy, public administration reform, judiciary and fundamental rights, freedom, justice and security, the existence of the functioning market economy, the possibility to cope with competitive pressure in the internal EU market, public procurement, statistics, financial control. Some of them are quite heavy for the implementation just because they don't have any specific benchmarks. It's not possible to limit ourselves just to implement simply certain laws or just to fulfill some quantity criteria. That really just requires very significant changes for the Ukrainian economy. And as was mentioned before, it's exactly in the sphere of these fundamental criteria, Ukraine is lagging behind. Any serious structural changes, they do require time. That's evident, and it's clear that the European Commission also understands that. Nevertheless, it's also clear that all of these structural changes, they start with reforms. And basically, in the European Commission, we have several remarks. The key challenges for Ukraine economic policies include the lack or the insufficient consistency, because some processes are changing very quickly before they have any chance to show their effectiveness. That's also the lack of the so-called policy that it would be based, evidence-based. So in the EU, that's supported with some special procedures, adopting some new legislative acts or other change of the acts. It should be accompanied by intensive advice with experts and stakeholders. From the good news, this approach becomes more and more popular in Ukraine. From the bad news, it once again is not happening in consistency. And once again, it's limited administrative and technical capacity to implement certain reforms. So from my side, that looks like it. I would like to thank you for the attention and enjoying my role of the moderator of the second part of the event. I want to go to the discussion. And for a start, we would like to give the floor to Ms. Maria Mizintseва Fedorenko, the Deputy Chair of the Committee of the Ukraine's integration to the European Union. Ms. Maria, we wanted to find out, like, how now in the conditions of European integration, how the legislative process is taking place, and if you can comment in some way the remarks that we don't have this expert analysis and the consultation with stakeholders and the like. Many thanks and welcome to all the participants, everybody who is available, both with camera on or without. I would like to thank you for this very profound and brief analysis. I would be critical. The Parliament and government, this was a very long meeting, but a lot of colleagues didn't understand its sense and started, this the question, the European integration issue, to promote at the meeting, which is reality should be more global. For instance, such a global issue where we can have 6,000 experts who need to move these 35 chapters. I'm operating this figure, which I'm seeing from the NGOs, like the Center of Economic Strategy, the organizations with whom we are working. I mean, my committee that is approximating Ukraine legislation to the European, we work since 2019. That's where we believe we will not do without the participation of NGO sector, engaging more experts to our subcommittees for European integration that were created already during the full-scale aggression in each committee of the Verkhovna Rada. And of course, we are trying until the end of the year. We have planned to work with Dixie Group and some other organizations who are doing the monitoring. The Green Deal that Ukraine has joined also voluntarily, and we knew back in 2021, and we knew which economic burden this will place on our budget, what challenges will result in our economic sphere. But during the full-scale invasion, you can agree with me that the government would be able to fill in 9 books of questions that had to be replied on a technical manner. We managed. We are having the status of the country candidate, the Eastern Partnership. Everybody got left out except for us and Moldova. I was in a building just 2 days ago where he didn't sign the agreement on association. I dreamt to be there in Vilnius, and once we have this status and when we are opening fundamentals, I think all experts would agree these are one of the most difficult parts of the reform. We can talk about the trades, about fishery. We have such a committee in the European Parliament, separate committee fishery, and such structures as the European Parliament itself. They give us the platform of the home office. It gives us more programs to engage colleagues from various committees. So we would also learn, be prepared. And let's put it the way. My prediction would be for the future, when it can happen, this could be the next political cycle from 2029, but we're not running out of time. We have a very difficult situation at the front. And very often, I'm saying that European integration is promoted by the defense forces. And it's not by chance that the peace facility, never it was for any country over the last 75 years, but the colleagues from the EU understand that today the value of the project that functions already for 75 years is also in our defense forces. So let's come to the point, which parliamentary vision, so not to waste too much of your time. We have conducted another committee today for European integration. We have looked at roughly 30 draft laws, maybe some know, some don't. We have added the function of preparing draft laws for the second reading, the remarks that our experts believe are relevant. We started to do this over the last half a year to make sure that in the second reading we would not have any cases that under the source of once again martial law, that we would have some non-European integration norms would be done, but derogations are still accepted when we talk about the assistance to the armed forces only during martial law, and this was concurred with the European Commission. As I said, we have the subcommittees for European integration in each committee. We are trying, if it's digital content, yes, I mean, today there was a law on roaming, and we are going over this not for the first year. We are putting together working groups that include NGOs, officials, business, and we're talking about the real sector of business. We have this separate idea on the basis of the subcommittee on approximating the Ukrainian legislation to European to create some cross-sectoral group and talk about the real assistance and the real requirements towards business that would be expected by our partners and which the business should be ready to implement. But business always requires assistance. That's not just the EU for business, that maybe not all the business may know. They mentioned here in the analytical note some additional information for grants, for financial capacity. That's really a very significant project that was created on the basis of Ministry of Economics. And our job is not to support business and to help find the job seekers job and to reprofile the people, but rather to really create new jobs. And we understand that we don't have any state money, it's the money from the taxpayers. It's very difficult for business. We are discussing the budget of the draft law in the second reading. Not all budget is ideal, but for the 6th year in the row, we will be voting for the budget, not on Christmas. And understanding that we have a lot of deficit, we will cover the needs that we can, where we were able to allocate 26% for security and defense, socially, constitutionally guaranteed articles such as pensions, payments to our teachers, educators, doctors, etc. And really, we're not talking just about the reforms. As for reforms, something is moving very slowly, like the judicial reform is very slow, but I have seen this report some positive aspects related to the anti-corruption activity. This was most positive. This was the most positive report that we have had over the last years. It pertains exactly for this topic. And this is also connected with filling the budget and returning the money of the Ukrainian citizens. So truly, I would also like to mention a certain human resource deficit. We can see this in the offices of parliamentaries and in the state sector, and that's where we really need to think how to stimulate this process. Not everybody is ready to become civil servants, but truly this is our job to take care about the reform of the public service, which I will remind you was voted by the parliament. There are a lot of various specialist laws. We are working directly with the this specialized service. We hope to complete it either in this year or in the beginning of the next year. And definitely we should not forget about Hromadas and territories. I want to inform you. Yes, I'm just reading comments that are coming now. I also want to inform you, my colleagues, that we definitely know that democracy and in general European integration, this is the grassroots of the most successful decentralization reform. So this year, in the summer, we made a decision by the Congress of the local governments to create 6 working groups, not by priority. All of the 6 are prioritized, but the 6th one is the European integration of Hromadas and territories. And that's where I would give this request, asking your assistance. I'm heading this group. We have a lot of people. They're delegated by the regions and by their Hromadas. That's not always easy. We first did the survey, which problems people are facing, and believe it or not, one of the most common problems is the lack of English skills, absence of access to grants, not knowing how to communicate, how to form and how to talk to sister cities. That's a much wider set of actions. It's not up to Kiev, it's not up to civil servants to understand what is European integration. It's actually about Ukrainians. More than 90% are for European integration. So in order to avoid such things that happened in Moldova, we need to work exactly at the regional levels. That's why we have this idea of launching special representatives for European integration. There is the idea to engage people who speak foreign languages. Of course, we will need funds for that, maybe not the state money, but the money from the partners, so that in this respect, we're conducting trainings, some preparatory works for several trips, some technical assistance to Hromadas, because I believe that our success will depend exactly from this. Briefly, maybe it didn't come out really briefly, but once again, I would like to thank you, and if you allow me to disseminate your analytics for all the committees of the Verkhovna Rada, especially the Specialized Committee, because it coincided with our recent interagency group with this topic. Many thanks for the provided possibility to talk. Many thanks for the very comprehensive reply and very detailed information. Definitely, of course, we'll be very happy. We are cooperating with the stakeholders, and in the part that pertains to European integration, I would be very happy. I would really love to pass the floor to Sergei Derkach, Deputy Minister for the Development of Hromadas and Territories of Ukraine. And I have 2 questions to you. In the first place, it is known that the condition of the Ukrainian infrastructure, this is something that permanently pops up in the reports of the European Commission, namely within the fundamental economic criteria, the possibility to cope with competition within the framework of the European Union, the availability of the functioning market economy. The Ukrainian infrastructure has significantly been affected, and maybe you can explain to us what is done to make sure we renew and rebuild in accordance with European standards, and how successfully this is taking place, and whether we are being helped by the European partners in this.
Дякую, Яна. Добрий вечір, колеги.
Thank you, Yana. Good evening, colleagues. Very happy to see everybody.
Дякую, теж приєднуюсь
I
до
would
Марії.
also like
Класна
to join
статистика,
Maria. Very
класна
good
аналітика.
statistics, very good analytics.
З позиції
From the point of view of the Ministry of Infrastructure, what I wanted to mention in part of the European integration,
то у нас тут
because we have three key chapters on our agenda. That's transport, that's TNT connection, and that's the regional policy. That is what is fixed under our ministry. Of course, we also participate in many working groups because some were tourism, some were post-mail, some other areas. But if we talk specifically about the infrastructure, that's a very comprehensive notion, because when we talk about the transport infrastructure, we can talk both about the roads and about the transport as such. I'm not even talking about the processes and procedures. And that's where we have the question. We have a lot of questions at the expense of which, whether Ukraine is actually ready. Are we talking from the position of some basic infrastructure? Then yes, Ukraine is ready, because we do have roads, we have ports, we have railway. But when we talk about to the extent how we are ready to open up markets, that's where we need to change legislation and to change approaches that can be easily tracked using the example of Ukrzaliznytsia, Ukrainian Railways, who is a monopolist on the transportation market, and according to the requirements of the European legislation, this is not acceptable. We have already registered the project to change approaches to forming policies and in general approach to the railway industry as such, but certainly there are certain nuances that need to be implemented. So when it comes, let's put it this way, I would bring this question to several ones. Is Ukraine ready from the point of view of infrastructure? Because our long way, that infrastructure should be ideal, but this is not the question of its readiness to the European standards, because to a great extent, much is already brought to the European standards, and we're working with this every day to make sure we prepare both the Ukrainian legislation and infrastructure to meet European standards. Good examples is, for instance, the infrastructure, which is the border control passage points. As you know, within the Ukraine facility, where we have certain KPIs which we have to fulfill. So the European Union gave us this assignment, which we basically formulated together with them, is the creating the strategy on expanding the border control passage infrastructure. And when we created it, we created for ourselves to understand how to further work with the automobile passage points, which are not enough. We have a big problem with this because the airline connection isn't working nowadays, and the majority of passengers are leaving exactly with the automobile transport, with road. Talking about the language of figures, we have almost 30 million passengers left last year, and Ukrzaliznytsia only 2. The rest was simply by road. Ukrainian railway don't bring all passengers, they can account only to 10%. The rest is done by on the road transport. It's either buses or regular cars. So the question is whether our passage points are ready for the European standards and our control procedures and the like. So nowadays we are with Poland and Slovakia, we are finalizing the procedure and the agreements on common control and this common checking points. This is a really great story, because we will be normalizing all the questions related to the Schengen, to the European customs issues, so that our passage points and the whole border control would be within the framework of the European standards. That's a good story. The other one is the border control infrastructure. It's about the strategy that I mentioned. We are almost ready with the strategy of expanding the border control infrastructure, and the unique situation that the European countries never had such a strategy. We are building it from scratch, and when colleagues from Europe tell us, from the European Commission, that you're not doing it's wrong, and we say, show us the example. They say, we don't have it. So we see it one way, you see it other way. We have to come to a common ground, but 6 years ahead, we are developing the plan of the expansion of the border control infrastructure, including roads. That includes not only roads, it also includes railway passage points.
різні
There is also a
колії,
big issue
тут
because there are
синтезно
various
працюємо для того, щоб
size of
якраз
rails,
поєднати
so we are
українську
trying to
інфраструктуру до європейської
unite the European
з часом, з конкретним
infrastructure with the
планом там на
Ukrainian,
майбутні
some
6
plans
років.
for the
Тому
future. So that's why
Тому,
answering your
відповідаючи на ваше
question,
питання,
I will
напевно,
tell you the
скажу
following
так, що
way.
українська, звісно, транспортна,
Definitely,
якщо ми
the
говоримо
Ukrainian
інфраструктура на
infrastructure
сьогодні на
is not
100% вона
ready by
готова
100%
там до
to some
повної
full
такого, я б сказав би, повного включення, да, або
connection, the
інтероперабіліті
so-called
такої повноцінної з
interoperability,
європейською системою, але це
prehensively with the European
теж
system.
не абсолютно не
But
по
again,
всіх
this
напрямках.
is not about all the
Що
directions.
стосується,
When
в
it comes
принципі,
to speeding up the
пришвидшення
process
процесу
of European
євроінтеграції,
integration,
тому що якщо ви
if you look at the
подивитесь звіт,
report
який був
that was
нещодавно
recently
представлений,
presented,
транспортний
then the
сектор
transportation
там
sector
в таких
is among
аутсайдерах, я б так
outsiders,
це
I would
назвав.
put it this way,
На жаль.
unfortunately.
Ось, то у нас, в принципі,
So we
є
have
хороша
some good
історія в
story
якому
in
сенсі.
which
У нас в
sense
парламенті
our parliament has
є декілька
several
законопроєктів, які
draft
є
laws which
просто
are quite
фундаментальними в
fundamental
сфері
in
транспорту,
the
і ми
area of
дуже
transport,
сподіваємося,
and we
що
really hope that the
колеги з
colleagues from the
парламенту дуже
parliament
швидко
will be able
зможуть
to quickly
їх
work on them
відпрацювати і
and to
прийняти,
adopt them,
тому що вони
because one
один
of
з
them
них
is very
фундаментальний по
fundamental
автомобільному
regarding the
транспорту, інший по
automobile
залізничному, і
transport,
третій
the
по
other one
водному
is
морському. Це дасть нам
about
можливість рухатись
railway and
вперед просто
sea
там
transport.
гігантськими
This
кроками,
will give
тому
us the
що після цих
possibility to move ahead
фундаментальних
in
законодавчих
gigantic
змін
leaps, because after these legislative
нас в
changes
Україні просто
in
ми можемо
Ukraine, we
далі там
can move
рухатися з
further
іншими
with
законодавчими
some
там
other
підзаконними актами.
legislative
Але
acts and
хороша
bylaws.
історія
But the
тут,
good
що
issue
в
is
деяких
here
сферах,
that in
наприклад,
some
там водному
areas,
або
be it the
автомобільному
water or the
транспорті,
automobile
ми
transport,
багато чого
much has
врегулювали
already been
вже на
regulated
підзаконних
at the level
актах.
of the
Тобто наш
bylaws.
ринок,
So
наприклад, не
our
буде
market will not
сильно
be very much
стурбований цим
surprised
законом. Ми,
looking at these laws.
це, скажімо
So
так,
it
мені
seems to
здається,
me
з
that from the positions
позиції
of forming
формування
the
політики це не ідеальна
policy,
ситуація, коли
when
підзаконними
the
актами
bylaws
формується
are
політика,
forming
а не
the
законами.
policy rather than
Але в нас
bylaws.
так
But
буває, на
unfortunately,
жаль.
that is the case.
Ось.
It's
І
happening
оця
like this,
ситуація, вона
and the
дуже
situation is
показова,
very
тому що
much
по деяких питаннях ми вже
exemplary
дуже сильно
because in
aligned
many
з
issues we are
Європейським
very much
Союзом,
aligned
да,
with the European
такі
Union.
дуже в нас
We have
відповідність є
good
хороша. Але немає
compatibility, but we don't have the
ґрунту. У нас багато
legislative
підзаконки, яка регулює ті чи інші
grounds. We have some bylaws that regulate
форми
various forms
роботи там
of working, for
конкретно в
instance, like
транспорті,
in
на жаль.
transport,
Ось, але
but
вони
they
повністю
fully
відповідають
meet the
європейським
European
стандартам.
standards.
Тому прийняття
So
цих законів,
adopting
воно
these
не
laws will
вплине
not significantly
суттєво
influence on the
на
market,
ринок, бо в
because in
інших
other
сферах є
areas we have
дуже великий
quite a
вплив і
big
дуже
influence, quite a big
дуже великий ризик
risk.
того, що можуть
There
бути
would
реально
be real
проблеми в
problems in
конкретному
the
секторі
concrete
економіки.
sector of economy.
Ось, то тут
So
не
it's not
завжди,
always
не беручи
that it's
залізничний напрямок, бо
the
це важкий
railway,
напрямок.
because it's quite heavy.
Ось, то тут, в
So
принципі, все
it's
вже
very
окей, ми
much
вже
okay
працюємо
here. We're working in
паралельно
parallel
з цим
with this
процесом.
process.
Ну і
And
останнє
the
пункт,
last
можливо,
thing
що
which I wanted
хорошого
to
в
mention, what
транспорті,
is
ми
good in the
домовилися з
transport,
Європейським
we
Союзом.
agreed with the European
Це
Union.
завдяки в
It's
тому
also
числі
thanks
і
to Ms.
пані
Olga
Ользі Стефанишині,
Stefanishina,
яка
who
якраз
is
в
in
Брюсселі
Brussels, who
допомогла
has
нам
helped us
зробити
to make
виключення
some
з
exceptions
процесу
from the enlargement
енларджменту,
process and
зробити
to make
прес-скрінінг.
the
Тобто в нас
so-called
є
press screening. We
домовленість
have
з
some
Єврокомісією, що в
agreement
нас
with the
буде
European Commission
такий суто
that we will
прес-скрінінг по
have this
транспорту і
press
по
screening for
енергетиці,
transport and energy,
неофіційний, тому що
unofficial,
офіційний скрінінг у нас
because the
заплановано
official
на середину
screening is
наступного
planned
року,
for the
а ось
mid next
прес-скрінінг це
year.
такий
But this
собі,
press
такий точно
screening is
скрінінг,
like a
але
mini
ми
screening
його
that we already
починаємо вже
started
зараз.
now.
І ми його
So we
почали
started
зараз,
it
і це
now.
дуже
It's very
класно,
good
тому що
because
в
in
транспорті,
transport,
щоб ви
for your
розуміли, у нас
understanding, we have
1600
1,600
4600 директив і
400,
регламентів, 4600. Це великий шмат
4,600
роботи теж, який
directives.
потрібно
That's a
буде
huge
опрацювати. І ми от
amount of
зараз вже
information that we would
почали
need to process. So
прес-скрінінг
we
з
started the
Єврокомісією.
pre-screening with
Я
the
минулого
European
року
Commission.
проводив
Last
першу
year I was doing the
зустріч,
first meeting, and
через
in
тиждень
1 week
25-го я буду в
I will
Брюсселі
be in
2 дні
Brussels for
якраз.
2 days.
Тому
So this
цей
process
процес
is
вже
already
пішов, і він однозначно
going on,
пришвидшує
and that speeds
нашу
up our
роботу.
work.
І
And I
я
really
сподіваюся,
hope
що
that
ми
over this
за цей
period of
період
time,
часу дуже
we
сильно
will
додамо в
add
частині
significantly in
транспортної
terms of the
інфраструктури,
transportation
якраз з
infrastructure from the
позиції
point of view of the European
євроінтеграції.
integration.
Тому,
So, colleagues,
колеги, це
that's
дуже
very briefly
коротенько
from
від
my
мене.
side.
Дуже
Many,
дуже
many, many
дякую. Будемо
thanks. We really
сподіватися,
hope
що
that the
процеси
process of the
євроінтеграції
European
позитивно
integration
вплинуть на
will
якість українських
positively
доріг.
affect the quality of the Ukrainian
Але
roads.
маю
But
ще
I
одне
have one
уточнююче
more
питання. В тому, що
clarifying
стосується
questions when it comes
регіональної
to the regional
політики. Скажіть, будь
policy.
ласка,
Please tell
як
us
ви
how do
ставитеся до
you
тієї ідеї, якою
treat
ділилася
this
з вами
idea
пані
that was
Марія, про те,
shared
що
by Maria to
створювати
create
все-таки
the
місцеві
local
представництва
representations
і
and
питання
the questions of the
регіональної
regional
політики
policy
трохи
to somehow to make it more
регіоналізувати.
regional. So that would be happening more on a centralized level. Basically, on a more decentralized level. Yeah, you're right. Our main objective is decentralization to the extent possible. That's the objective where we are trying to hit. Operational problem that we have with this is very much objective. We are now in the condition of war. And once again, that reflects a lot on the situation in the country and the possibility of forming policy. Let's put it this way, in a very gradual, very healthy pace. That's why nowadays, I believe with our colleagues, with the parliamentaries, we are very much similar in concept, and we are truly going to full decentralization in all spheres to the extent possible. But again, how much quickly it will be, and how we can not delay all of these processes, it also depends on the situation in the country. But the strategy of regional development that we have, it actually foresees this way. So it's here, it's approved, and on the basis of this strategy, we are moving. Many thanks. I would pass the floor to Ms. Yulia Shipova, the Senior Project Manager of the Support of Reforms of the Ministry of Economics. And my question is the following. As it's known, we have had the first meetings with the European Commission in terms of the sections that pertain to fundamental criteria. Could you share how this is all happening and whether we have any more concrete recommendations in terms of the economic criteria, how we can really improve them before we exceed the European Union? Thank you, Yana. Welcome, colleagues. Thank you. That's a great event and a very important discussion. It's important to discuss how, in general, the process of screening is organized. In Ukraine, we have this very much artificial understanding how the process of acceding to the European Union is taking place. Somebody has to go to Brussels and to talk with Ursula von der Leyen and to make a decision that Ukraine is now a member of the EU. Unfortunately, this process is long, very much bureaucratized, and thousands of people that will be working on the implementation of the EU acquis, and this screening process is made sure to better understand what exactly should be done by Ukraine to finally come closer to the EU law in these 55 sections. Truly, the first cluster has already completed the screening. We are expecting the report that will be available in the end of this year, beginning of the next year, and we already started the screening of the second cluster, which is not the most important, but still quite needed, because the European Union is, first of all, the economic bloc, so this is also very much important. And the process is that the European Union, the European Commission sent us the questionnaires, even more detailed, about how legislation regulates certain spheres, and we're giving them some answers to this, and we are preparing also presentations to a number of topics. And then our delegations. So we are taking some obligations to do this, and based on these meetings, we provide the report within cluster that helps us to understand which is the volume of the works that is still ahead of us. And the enlargement report that was mentioned by many speakers, it basically gives this high-level picture of what is happening in each of these spheres. With this, screening reports are more detailed. We better understand what is the approximation status in terms of concrete directives or regulations. Why in some spheres the progress is more, in some areas less. making a lot of reforms also within the Ukraine facility that was also mentioned today. That from the one hand, that is not connected to European integration directly with the process of accessing the European Union. It's a separate track, but it still make sure that we could approximate to the law of the EU and fulfill the criteria in terms of how we can approximate to all the criteria and to better fulfill our obligations. That's quite a complicated question because in many spheres, the reason why we are not fulfilling our obligations or we don't have any significant process, it's the war. So much is put on hold because of the military activities, and some things we can change slowly. Like, for instance, this year the National Bank has significantly relaxed the limitations on foreign currency exchange. So much liberalization is going on, but still, for some things, we need time. We still have the law about the state assistance, the unblocking of this law and returning to the rules that acted before, and the ones that are approximating us. This is also an obligation within the Ukraine facility. So slowly we're fulfilling certain things, but some it's quite difficult to fulfill until the end of the war. For instance, if we take the issue of agriculture, the agricultural land, the sales to foreigners is not allowed based on the Ukrainian legislation, and to change that, we need to make the all-Ukrainian referendum, where we need to collect 3 million signatures, and we all understand that the referendum under the Ukrainian legislation is not possible to conduct. So when we can at least approximate even how to talk about it, that's a big question and a big challenge for us, but our European colleagues understand that, and they understand that we from our side, we're doing everything possible, because in reality, that Ukraine is fulfilling its obligations and moves ahead in terms of the European integration track. That's quite an achievement. Some countries of the Western Balkans are for 20 years in the progress, and they're moving even slower than Ukraine, which is also defending itself from the Russian aggression. And at the same time, we managed to make reforms quicker than countries that live in full peace. So we had some good comments from Mr. Borrell, who was in Kiev the other day, and he mentioned that we are moving faster than many of our colleagues. Many thanks. We have a similar comment about the section that pertains to the market economy, because we understand that the functional and absolute market economy in the conditions of the war, this is something that is very unlikely to be achieved. From the other hand, from us, the European Commission wants to see some steps in this direction. And please tell me, is my intuition telling me right? That consists of all of these reports, that whatever they don't expect a quick result from us, we need at least to have some viable strategy and some signals that it will be implemented. Yes, in general, like this, if we take even obligations on the Ukraine facility, many of these obligations believe that we should simply develop a strategy for the time being, at least to make some framework, just to understand where we're moving. At the same time, our reforms, it's also some of our obligations within IMF, obligations to the World Bank. This is some steps that need to be done. Like, I mean, the judicial reform is a huge level of work in various levels, in various areas. Yes, you're right. At least they want to have some minimum commitments that we are, at least if we are not running, if we are not walking, at least we are lying and laying in the proper direction. Many thanks, and I'd like to pass the floor to the representative of the EU at this event, Alberto
Альберто
Fernandez-Diez,
Фернандо-Дієс, керівник
the head
торгово-економічного
of the
відділу
trade
делегації ЄС в
section of
Україні.
the EU delegation in
Дуже
Ukraine.
дякую,
Many
що ви
thanks
сьогодні з нами.
to you for
І я
being
б
with
хотіла
us, and I would
вас
like to
прокоментувати
ask you to comment
перспективи
the
вступу
prospects of
України
Ukraine's
до ЄС
accession to the EU from the
саме з
point of
точки
view of
зору
the economy,
економіки. Тому що
because
Україна
Ukraine
все-таки
is
досить
still a
велика
big economy
економіка з
with the
розвиненим
developed
аграрним
agrarian
сектором,
sector,
окремими галузями,
various areas,
зокрема металургічною.
metallurgical sphere. How
Як це
is it
все
all in
взагалі
general
вплине
going to
на
affect Ukraine
Україну і
and
на
the EU?
ЄС? Очевидно, що
Evidently,
це
this
буде
will be a
певний
certain
шок.
shock.
І що ми
And what
можемо
can we do
робити
now
зараз,
to make
щоб
sure
цього
that
шоку
this
максимально
shock can
уникнути
be avoided as
на
much as
стадії
possible at the stage
імплементації
of the
європейського
implementation of the
акquis?
European acquis?
Hello, good afternoon. You can hear me well, I hope. I first would like to thank you for this event. I think it shows that Ukraine is taking full ownership of the accession process, which is massive, and it's not an easy one, as was mentioned before by some representatives of the government. The volume of EU legislation, or as we call it here, EU acquis, is quite substantial, and in some cases it might appear a bit overwhelming. So, as was said several times, EU accession is not a sprint, it's a marathon, so it's a long-term process, but it's a long-term process driven by reform. So Ukraine is adapting to the very complex ecosystem that we have in the European Union, in which all the member states operate. So the idea is that once this process is over, Ukraine will be equal in terms of ecosystem to any member state, and just operate in that context as an equal partner. What was published last month, the Enlargement Report, is a compilation of factual, systematic assessments of the progress that Ukraine has done in the context of EU accession. So this is a very factual report that has fed with a lot of information that we have received from the authorities, some of them here present, but also from the civil society and think tanks, other stakeholders play a key role in this. So I would like to thank you for this. This is something that is recognized, and it helps drive the debate forward and bring understanding about the complexity of this process. We have assessed in this report, as I said, a factual report, the level of progress in Ukraine, both in terms of reforms, political system, and compare it to what is desirable in the context of a normal EU member state. We don't cover here domestic issues in Ukraine which are not linked to EU accession. So this is wanted to emphasize that it's a very factual assessment. So what you have seen published on the 30th of October is a factual assessment, and there we recognize that Ukraine has achieved on a general level progress, as was mentioned before in the presentation by Jana, in all by one chapter. And this reflects that Ukraine has done a lot, and this is also to be recognized in a context, in a very difficult context, because as was mentioned before, Ukraine is fighting a war, and yet is progressing on the accession, and this is remarkable. Now, nevertheless, a lot of work remains to be done in the context of accession. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon, but the accession process has getting renewed political backing in the new commission. The political guidance published in July for the new commission 2024-2029 by von der Leyen recognizes that accession is a priority, and recognizing also there is a merit-based process, but accession will be given a lot of attention in the new commission. This is also reflected in the mission letters for the incoming commissioners. You know that the hearings finished on Tuesday, and hopefully we'll have a new commission in place as of December, and work will start immediately on that. That's the accession report. On the screening meetings that were mentioned before, indeed, we are now finalizing the fundamentals cluster, which is the most important cluster according to the revised methodology for accession. This is the pillar that underpins the other clusters. And we will expect to have a report ready by the end of this year or early 2025, and hopefully be able to open this cluster first soon into 2025, subject to the findings in this report. You know that this process depends not only on the European Commission, depends on the Council. We are now starting the cluster 2, which is the internal market cluster. I think on this one, Ukraine is quite has more advanced because of the work that has been done under the association agreement, and including the deep and comprehensive free trade area. So many of the acquis in this area, for instance, one fundamental part of the internal market is technical standards, is quite advanced, and this will be, of course, recognized, and this has been recognized in the context of the enlargement package. And I think Ukraine should continue to build on that. Now, on this specific topic, I would like to emphasize as well in the political guidelines for the new commission, but also in the mission letter for the new commissioner for enlargement, there is a clear reference to gradual integration. So it doesn't mean that Ukraine has to wait until the full accession to start to reap the benefits for accession. There are many options to tap on the existing tools that we have at our disposal to get Ukraine already integrated into selected parts of the internal market. And this would be only a recognition of the progress that Ukraine has done in some areas, and this would go in the direction of getting Ukraine more and more gradually integrated into the internal market, and this also before of accession. And this will be a priority next year. You maybe saw the communication on pre-enlargement policies in March. There are two main areas there. So one is helping Ukraine, so the candidate countries to reap the benefits of the internal market already now, when they are ready in specific areas. Now, footnote on this is complex because many of the areas in the internal market depend also on the fundamentals cluster, so the role of the Court of Justice or other areas. It's a very complex ecosystem in the EU, but we're working on that. There is a lot of people in the European Commission working on that. And the second is, as was mentioned before, is the EU reform. There are many, now we will start to discuss the new multi-annual financial framework for post-2027, and there will be a lot of discussions about that idea. The idea is that Ukraine gets the role it deserves into the new financial framework, and the continue funding of the reconstruction, but also of the reforms, and adapt the EU main tools that we have in the internal market to enlarge union with more than 27 member states. Now, going more concretely on the economic criteria, well, you saw the report. In the case of economic criteria, progress has been recognized, and this was mentioned in the previous presentations. Ukraine economy is doing relatively well despite the difficulties that it has. We see a strong commitment to reforms in Ukraine, both under the Ukraine plan. This year, the facility would have disbursed at the end of the year 16 billion. The IMF program, the 5th review was successfully completed. Now we're waiting for the outcome of the 6th review as the team is in town. And then we have also seen that Ukraine has started to gradually reapply market principles that were suspended at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, manage exchange rate, gradual easing of the restrictions on foreign currency, and also the re-implementation of medium-term budget planning. The budget declaration for 2025-27 was adopted, and this is recognized in the report. We recognize also the economic resilience. The economy is doing relatively well. And we also see, despite this progress, some deficiencies. But again, this is not a criticism. This is just part of the factual nature of the assessment that we do in the enlargement package. So there are some issues when it comes to the functioning of the market economy. Trade deficit is widening. This is explained by the higher demand for war-related imports, but also by bottlenecks that jeopardize the exports. This is quite unfortunate, but this has an impact on the assessment, of course, on the economic part of the assessment. Public finances, we see a huge pressure on the budget due to the continued increase in military expenditure. And one element of concern that is highlighted in the report is the labor shortages. In this sense, the recommendations that were issued under this pillar go in this line. Fiscal increase the tax base, continue implementation of the revenue strategy, and institutional measures. It was mentioned before in this call the capacity constraints in Ukraine, so this is also recognized. Of course, we work together with our Ukrainian friends to mitigate these issues and to provide trainings and to provide capacity building measures for the institutions that need to implement a very ambitious reform. Tackling the labor shortages is a key priority as well in the current context, because this is said to have a big negative impact on the economy. When it comes to the capacity to cope with the competitive pressure in the union, limited progress was recognized. Now, this is due also to the large destruction of energy infrastructure, and this is something that is jeopardizing the economy. So on that, there is the vector of the assessment. But again, I reiterate that the assessment that is done is factual. It's not a criticism. It's just a factual description of the situation. But we try to mitigate it with substantial financial support to help Ukraine address those issues, provide more education and training to align the base of labor, human capital with the needs in the market in terms of skills, and continued implementation of the investment roadmap, the public investment roadmap. So all these recommendations are made in a way that aims at helping Ukraine to address the right issues, to prioritize in a context when the capacity of the institutions is quite how to say, under pressure, because there are lots of reforms, and colleagues here from the Ministry of Economy, Ministry of Infrastructure know how difficult this is. But we continue to provide support, and of course the EU delegation is ready to listen when it comes to needs, to provide additional support. We're in contact with several institutions in Ukraine to help mitigate the gap in understanding of some of the legislation that has to be done, or for that we provide assistance and trainings. The pre-screening that Deputy Minister Derkash mentioned is a good example of how we can help the authorities and the staff in the ministries get acquainted with the volume of acquis. Honestly, I think it's very difficult. This process, I think, is very complicated. But again, this is a long-term, but medium-term endeavor. I think this will help Ukraine, and it's not there is light. There is light because we will explore options for greater integration, and as Ukraine gets aligned further and further to the EU acquis, this will of course lock in additional investments into the country, because the economy will be assessed as functioning as the same level as a member state, and this is what happened in new member states before. And we expect the same effect to happen in Ukraine, compounded with what they call some economists the Phoenix effect of the reconstruction. This will lead to an economic recovery successfully on the path of EU accession. Thank you. Thank you.
Many thanks. And before we finalize, I want to ask all the panelists if you have any comments, any questions to one another. Would you want to give any replies during the discussion to some questions that were asked during the discussion? So in such a case, many thanks again for coming over to us today. I will pass the floor back to Gleb. Basically, we could just finish it. Many thanks to everybody who has joined us. It was a wide topic which we could cover within a very short period of time, but I think for many who are not connected in the process of European integration, this was useful. And even in chat, we have already engaged the representatives of the beekeeping to the discussion with the parliamentaries and with the governmental institutions. I really hope that everything will get out really fine. We see a huge need to be actively engaged by business, participate in the process of negotiations. So Yana and myself and everybody in Center of Economic Strategy, we are trying to build up these connections. Everybody who's interested, you can get maximum use from that. So once again, many thanks to Mr. Alberto. We can see an active role of the representation and European Commission in general to help Ukraine go through this way ASAP and with the best way. So once again, many thanks. Everybody have a nice evening.